This is Tim Cook, and I'm at Canada's History, and I'm talking about my 2-volume history of Canada in the Second World War, The Necessary War, and Fight to the Finish. Well, I wrote a 2-volume history on the First World War at the Sharp End and Shock Troops, and those came out in 2007, 2008, and I said I would never write another 2-volume history, at least back-to-back histories. But you forget these things, and I began to research and be increasingly interested in the Second World War. I had a grandfather who flew in RAF, in Bomber Command, and I've been working on the Second World War with other books, and I began to read the letters and the diaries of the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the nurses, and it really struck me that there was a story there, and so I decided to write a 2-volume history. It's the first time there's ever been a 2-volume history of the fighting forces, and it's told with, I think, the eyewitnesses front and center, those who served, those who endured, those who tried to make sense of the war, those who fought, those who died. But it's also the story of Canada and Canada's fighting forces, fighting on all fronts, and then as well trying to fold that into the international story. So it's a complex tale, but one that I've tried to lay out in these 2 books. I think it is a big picture or an overview book. I've relied heavily on the hundreds of books that have been published. And so there are many battle studies of the Battle of the Atlantic or Battle of Hong Kong or Dieppe or the Italian campaign. But one of the things that struck me was that there wasn't really an up-to-date, relevant 2-volume history based on this existing research, but also augmented with the personal stories. And so I was trying to meld the two, trying to take a comprehensive look at the war and Canada's role in it, but also to lead with those who served. And I don't think that there's a book or a series of books like that out there, and that was part of the appeal in researching and writing it. My grandfather, Gordon Cook, flew in RAF from the start of the war. In fact, he was from the West and from Lethbridge. Saw war coming. He had lived through the Depression, and like so many Canadians, had only spotty jobs, never able to hold down anything for very long. He went overseas in June of 1939, so a couple months before the start of the war, enlisted in the RAF, and he served throughout the war, and his career was a very interesting one. He flew in 1939 and up until the Battle of France. He came back to Canada as a trainer and served in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the incredible plan where Canada built airfields and schools across this country and trained 131,000 airmen. And then he went back overseas and served in the Mediterranean theater, and he survived the war. He crashed into a mountain, and I had his logbook, and my father and I would talk about his dad's experience, my grandfather's experiences. He passed away in 1974, so I was only a couple of years old at the time, but it was a chance to connect, I guess, with the history, with the veterans, and with the memory of the war. And that's a part of the book that is important to me. It's a book largely about the fighting experience, but I have a chapter on veterans, and I look at how veterans reintegrate back into society and how they built up Canada. And then a chapter on the memory of the war, and that's perhaps one of the more interesting areas where it's, of course, this very contentious memory. How do we honor? How do we remember? How have we forgotten the experience of the Second World War? And so I try to get my head around that and to lay that out in the final part of Fight to the Finish. The Second World War has often been called the Good War. The war fought against Hitler and the Nazis and the Italian fascists and the Japanese military fascists. Most people, I think, would agree with that, even those who are largely against war, as we all should be, would say that this was a war that probably had to be fought. But I thought, in labeling it the Good War, it's a war of unparalleled savagery, of incredible brutality, 60 million dead worldwide, most of those civilians. It was a war that deliberately took combat and killing to civilians, and the numbers are astronomical. And so that, coupled with the U-boat campaigns, trying to sink ships across the Atlantic and around the world, with the Allied, first the German bombing, I suppose, of European cities, and then the Allied bombing campaign that killed over 600,000 Germans. This is a war that had to be fought, but maybe good war is not the right term. And so I thought The Necessary War was an important title for the first book, and it really sets, I think, the framework from where I'm writing from. And I think it is a necessary war. Canadians believed that at the time, and I think many would believe that to this day. That necessity demanded an incredible exertion. 1.1 million Canadians serving in uniform, 45,000 killed, 55,000 wounded, Canada fighting on all fronts, and I think it's a war that forever changed Canada, and one to some degree that is still with us today. I think the war reverberates over time. I think the fact that we still have about 80,000 veterans, but we're losing them very quickly. Hundreds die every week across this country, and within 5 or 10 years, we will be down to very few veterans. And they have something to tell us. I think this was a generation that felt compelled to serve. Many served because Britain was at war. We're very much a British country still, even though we were fully autonomous with the Statute of Westminster, and we decided to go to war. But it was almost unthinkable that we would not serve in this war. So it tells us something of the Canada of 1939 to 1945. Of course, it's a Canada that came out of the Depression, suffering horrendously. And by the end of the war, despite the terrible bloodletting and the terrible losses and the terrible grief, we emerged a much wealthier middle power, which really set us on the course throughout the 20th century. The Second World War, with its massive industrialization, with Canada striding onto the world stage, fighting with our allies, these were monumental changes to the country. And I think over time, what's interesting, though, is that we've largely forgotten about the Second World War as a major factor in our country. I think the peacekeeping idea and peacekeeping myth, as some have called it, I wouldn't go that far. We are a proud nation of peacekeepers in the second half of the 20th century. We often see ourselves in relation to the Americans as a more peaceful nation. I think we are. But we also fought 6 wars in the 20th century. And so it took a long time for Canadians to come to grips with the Second World War. When the veterans came back, they were mostly young men and young women. They didn't build great memorials. They added their names to the First World War memorials for those who had fallen. There's no additional national memorial. It took a while for the First World War memorial in Ottawa to be embraced as the Second World War memorial. There's no Vimy equivalent memorial overseas. Even though the Second World War is really a critical event in our history, it was largely forgotten, I think, until the 1990s. And this is what I talk about in the memory chapter, about how the Second World War came back. And it largely came back with the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, and about 15,000 veterans who went overseas, who were greeted and celebrated and feted by the French and the Belgians, and especially the Dutch, whose country we had liberated. We had liberated all those countries. And then I think Canadians woke up to that, and we have spent maybe the last 2 decades more deeply engaged with thinking about war. Certainly the war in Afghanistan has compelled us to think about Canada as a war-fighting nation. And all of this, I think, makes sense in this, the 75th anniversary of the start of the war, and 1940 and the 70th of the end of the war. We're coming to a time where we are losing our veterans, and I thought it was important, perhaps, to write a big book, 2 books, to capture that experience.